I've been chosen to be a secret speaker, because I'm pretty shit at keeping secrets. I do like to keep my talks pretty intimate, though. So I'm going to whisper to you like the moon to the tides today and ask you to come a little closer. Especially those of you in the back, all of the students, could you come and sit in the front here? Those of you in the front row, could bring your chairs a little bit closer. I mean, we could even start a mass migration here. Let's all come closer. Yes, like the moon to the tides. Beautiful. Much better. That's beautiful. Thank you. No, stay. Yeah, stay. Gorgeous. Like the moon to the tides. We can go to the next slide now. First of all, I'm just going to say this is really beautiful to see all of you here so close, because I'm going to be telling a lot of personal stories, and so I like it when it feels a bit more intimate. Just wait for everyone to trickle in. Yeah, this is quite the mass migration. Beautiful. God. Beauty is my mother tongue. Beauty is my first language. You'll know it because I speak it. I'm going to tell you a story about my mother, Shilo Suleman. When I was much younger, when I was about 7 years old, she would open all the windows in our house and open all the doors that led to a garden. She would shut off all the lights, and she would make me, my brother, and her sit on a couch in the middle of our living room. And we would wait and wait and wait for fireflies to come in from the garden outside. They would trail their illuminated paths through our living room, stay with us for a little while, and then they would leave again. Now, this was a moment of tremendous trauma in her life. But yet, even in this moment of deep fear, she had this incredible capacity for magic. And magic there has been. My mother, her work has documented the visual history of this nation in single hair brushstrokes. She remembers her childhood as love stories across communal lines, Iranian cafes, stories about adulterous gods, and abundant mustaches.
These accidents that happen, follow the dot. Coincidence makes sense only with you. You don't have to speak, I feel emotional landscapes. They pass on me, the little gets salt. And you push me up to this state of emergency. How beautiful to be.
And magic there has been. That was some of my work. I have made art installations out in the desert at Burning Man with neuroscientists that react to the beating of your heart. I've made installations that react to tidal data from the oceans. They pull data out of the oceans and channel them into light. I've made installations that react to your breath, forests that as you breathe in and breathe out with humidity sensors, circle these trees up with light. I've worked with communities across the world on representing their stories, from queer communities in Beirut to communities ridden by gang war in Pakistan. But we didn't always speak in beauty, my mother and me. My mother married very young on a rebound outside of her religious upbringing. She moved to Singapore, she cut off all her family ties, she had 2 children, and she took up map making as a hobby, as a way of passing her time. She used to recreate old maps with a single hair brush and a diamond cutter's eyeglass in the smallest room of our house. It was barely big enough to fit her drafting table. This was also the only room that was lit in dark hours, so at night there would be moths above her flickering, watching her paint. Sometimes at midnight I would stumble out of bed with heavy eyelashes and see her perched at her table, summoning rivers and mountains with her fingers. Stepping out of one dream and into another, I was completely in love. Here was a woman who could make a world. Towards the end of her relationship with my father, I remember one night him tearing her maps in anger. Continents lay on the floor. We tried to piece it together, but the eventual severing of their marriage taught me that beauty could be reclaimed even in really broken places. I eventually used fragments of those torn maps in my art. So I can say for certain that beauty saved me. Beauty became both into the financial as well as the emotional backbone of my family. My father was a magician, very well known for his disappearing acts, and one night he vanished. My mother found herself responsible for 2 children, and she began to teach art. At 14, I used to carry her basket of crayons and assist her. During the day, she would work 2 jobs and sustain us, and at night, she would paint. And at first, we poured the pain out of our body, 1 bottle of ink at a time. We made black rivers on paper that made their way down these hard mountain faces, and our work was full of abandonment and pain. But here is the marvelous thing about pain. If you stay with it for long enough, it begins to change. It begins to shapeshift. And shapeshift we did. Lifetime upon lifetime, lesson upon lesson, we transformed. Coral to chrysalis, mineral to mountain, oxygen into sunlight, claw, crystal, eyelash, deity, mystic, empress, dust. We lifted out of murky waters and became into the straight-spined flowers that emerged from its depth. At 32, she went to Bombay. She went to try and find a gallery. I made her first catalog on Microsoft Word. It was an A4 catalog. I printed it out at a regular printers, and we went from one gallery to another, showing this until she was finally picked up by an agent, and the rest is art history. At the same time, at 16, I started to illustrate stories of my own life in thick red hand-bound journals. I started to tell my own story and found that I could tell other stories too. That led me to illustrating books for children with 10 published books at the age of 18, a TED Talk with 1 million views at the age of 21. And people often ask me, what was it like growing up with a mother who was an artist? But the truth is that the artists in us really grew up together. Beauty saved us. And so, in return, I protect beauty. I have a question here for everybody. How many of you in this room can say that beauty saved you? It could be anything from the first time that you picked up a paintbrush to the first time that you saw a smile on someone to the way that the ocean feels. Can everyone say beauty saved you? So let's put our hands to our hearts for a second. and close our eyes for just 1 minute and take a deep breath in and whisper under our breaths, "Beauty saved me." And so, in return, I protect beauty. I run an organization called Fearless, and much like my own story, we use methodologies of self-representation and beauty to reclaim our imagination from fear. Particularly as women, our ability to imagine is this vital source of creativity, abundance, and power. And so the Fearless Collective began in 2012, around the same times as the Nirbhaya protest. I was very involved with technology at that point and doing interactive art installations at that point. But I went out onto the streets and realized I had to return to the most basic technology of my body. That was the first step. It began quite accidentally as this movement of hundreds of women representing their own stories through these beautiful posters as this viral online campaign and telling their own stories without fear. Since then, it's grown into a public art project.
I want more men with flowers falling from their skin. More water in their eyes, more tremble in their bodies, more women in their hearts than on their hands. More softness in their height, more honesty in their voice, more wonder, more humility in their feet. Deep in the belly of old Bangalore is an amazing sanctuary. Mountains of flowers line every corner and wrap themselves around wrists, hair, and adorn the gods. Our cities are not only gendered spaces, but increasingly aggressive, and KR market is a stark contrast to the rest of Bangalore. And so we began to ask ourselves, what was the role of gentleness, of softness, of kindness within public space, and how does that relate to masculinity? In this market, the flowers are all measured, woven, and sold by men. We began our work here with conversations around the differences between men and women, the roles that our father took versus the roles our mothers took, who was softer, who was harsher with us, who was strict, whether they could or should be interchangeable. What did it mean to be a gentleman? Did working with flowers every day make one any gentler? We then collectively composed an image, took photographs of local vendors in the market, and started to project. And ironically, as we began this exploration of gentleness, our first night was met with much aggression and conflict. On the first floor, the tool sellers in the market insisted that we needed to paint either an image of the king or an image of a famous actor. Very often in Bangalore, we celebrate our gods, actors and politicians, or even the dead, but never local people. In one of the conversations with the flower vendors, it came up that if men weren't aggressive, no one would listen to them. And slowly we began to unfold over the days when it is important to listen to men and even just each other, gender aside. As the days went on, gender roles were slowly opening their petals for us. Some of the boys who started to wear jasmine around their wrists, and that led to having long debates about whether that was something a man could do. Simultaneously, girls climbed up on long towers of scaffolding to paint and then wondered, is that something a woman could do? Perhaps in this Fearless workshop, it wasn't just about the dialogue, but also about the embodied practice. In the flower market, two men emerged from the flowers, weaving a garland of jasmine between their fingers, as if embodying the softness of the flowers. Roses burst from their skin and beards, and they are fearless and gentle.
So essentially the way that we work at the Fearless Collective is we engage with underrepresented communities in these deeply immersive workshops. We use ritual and ceremony actually as a way of getting into very deep emotional spaces and allowing for people to tell their own stories. We can go to the next slide. Actually, we can go to the previous slide. Yeah. So none of the girls in this image have ever painted before in their lives, but we believe that beauty is actually quite accessible. I developed a bunch of techniques that allows for people who have very little skills to be able to participate in representing their own bodies. And very often it's also an act of fearlessness for some of the women and girls from these communities to be out in the streets in the first place. We make huge, beautiful representations of our communities. These are monuments to the living, as we see monuments to big politicians and actors, but very rarely do we see monuments to people who actually live in those spaces. And our language is always affirmative and beautiful. So for example, when I painted a huge image of a 40-foot image of a transgender sex worker in Pakistan, it said, "Hum hai taklik-e khuda," I am a creation of Allah, instead of saying stop violence against the transgenders or stop violence against women. Hum hai taklik-e khuda, I am a creation of Allah was the most radical thing that a Hijra woman in Pakistan could say. So our language is always very beautiful and affirmative. Our methodology is totally open source and it's being used by artists across the world. I got this image, for example, one Christmas of these girls in Pakistan climbing up on ladders and stools that they'd borrowed from their aunties and wheat pasting images of themselves being affectionate with each other in public space, which was pretty radical. You can go to the next slide. Or this image was another image I got from Pakistan shortly after the project there. There was a bomb blast in Lahore, and a group of young, fearless artists went out onto the streets the day after the bomb blast and painted this mural at its site. And so in actual moments of national trauma, instead of responding with fear, people responded with beauty. And I believe beauty has this ability to become into a force of resistance. Beauty really is the antidote to all the terror that we see in the world. We've painted with communities in Pakistan, with communities of queer feminists in South Africa. We've painted in Brazil and Indonesia with indigenous communities and sex workers. We painted with Koli fisherwomen in Kolaba, with Syrian and Armenian refugees in Beirut, representing their own stories. But for all the traveling that I do, I also do come home, and then me and my mother fight. Now, most of the fights at home, believe it or not, involve color palettes, I swear. We have flamed livid about choices between Naples yellow of a million, or whether it should be a ruby pink bougainvillea plant, or whether it should be an eggshell white jasmine branch, or why my Prussian blue brush strokes are so damn messy. And Photoshop lessons that I try and fail to give her. My brother, whose work is there, Shilo Shiv Suleman, he ended up becoming into a graphic designer too after rejecting it for many years. For many years, he used to come to us and say, I want to be an accountant. And me and my mother would just be like, what? Why? But he eventually rejected all of our maximalist tendencies and then got into very minimal graphic design. And eventually, he decided to abandon that too, and now all he does is program AI. A few months ago, however, me and my mother had our biggest argument to date. While we may have crossed the gender gap together and leapt across, cavernous personal fear and those gaps together, we still have a pretty solid generation gap. I have an ancient heart, but I come from an internet generation. I've had a blog, I've had a Tumblr, I've had a MySpace, I've had a SoundCloud, a Facebook, an Orkut, a Hi5, a Behance. I've invested in Bitcoin, and I've put up semi-naked pictures of myself on Instagram. Nilofer, however, is old world and old school. So one day, she found a picture that I had put out, bare-bodied, ribs exposed. The photograph in question was taken by one of my best friends, who is a female photographer, who has known my body since I was 13 years old, and it was a reference for a painting of mine. Nilofer, my mother, knocked on the studio door. She was scarlet red, angry, and she asked me, what is wrong with you? Have you no shame? Are you doing all of this for male attention? Male attention? 5 years into running a feminist art project whose core work was to represent women's bodies by ourselves, for ourselves, you can imagine that I was devastated. This was my role model, like the greatest feminist that I know, has brought up these two incredible kids by herself, but yet she was saying that the only reason that I am comfortable with my own body is for a man. All the doors and windows in our house were closed. no fireflies made their way into our living room now. For 3 days, we didn't speak to each other. And then slowly the silence was broken through offerings of tea, through little snacks that we left outside. What followed was a delightful and difficult conversation on the politics of representing the female form, the male gaze, how centuries of artists had represented women's bodies laid out across beds emerging from churning oceans, but never with a sense of bodily autonomy and agency over our own skin. It was crucial, I reassured her, for brown, queer, female artists like Frida Kahlo and Amrita Shergill and me to represent our own bodies. Her anger, obviously, wasn't from disapproval or shame or disagreement with my politics, but from fear. In her generation, women were punished for showing too much strength, too much skin. Their struggle was about being, fighting to be educated, surviving domestic abuse, all of the stigma around divorce. This was a generation of women that were fighting for equal rights while personally coming to terms with their own bodies, just even for themselves, let alone celebrating it on the internet or in public space. So yes, she is a feminist, and yes, she is an artist, but she's still a mother. And my grandmother was married off in rural Rajasthan at 13 years old. My mother cut off the sleeves from her t-shirt and snuck out of the house to go for Remo concerts, so that I now can make an altar of my own body. Beauty is the antidote. And we need to reclaim beauty. We need to reclaim beauty from glamour. We need to reclaim beauty from luxury. In traditional cultures around the world, but particularly in India, even those on the margins had access to beauty. From the kolam patterns that we see on the ground, to the malipu in our hair, our swords, our utensils, our ceremony, even our ceremonies of death were beautiful. And we also really have to fight against the standardization of beauty, the unification of beauty. While ideas of what is pure and what is impure, what is beautiful and what is ugly have always existed in India, British colonization and now capitalism has tried to impose a universal notion of what is beautiful and what is pure. And beauty isn't just about a vacant prettiness, it's a rising to grace. It's a capacity for grace that we all have. As John O'Donohue puts it, it's a more rounded becoming. It's an emerging fullness. Beauty moves me, and I'm sure it moves you. It's the stirring of emotion. And while Nilofar's world stirs through past and memory, mine hopefully stirs through future and possibility. So stay near beauty, because she will lift your mouth close to hers and breathe. Thank you.